Hello and welcome to Roots and Realities. I'm your host, Manu Nellutla. Today we are traveling to one of the most isolated places on Earth, a single volcanic triangle of land, just 63 square miles, set in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The nearest continent is over 2,000 miles away. We know this as Easter Island, but its first inhabitants called it Rapa Nui. And guarding this remote island are the Moai, hundreds of colossal stone statues, some weighing dozens of tons, with their gaze fixed inland, as if they are watching over a story we have all been told again and again. The story we hear is a powerful cautionary tale of ecocide, a society so locked in a competitive, status driven obsession with building these statues that they say that they had to clear cut their entire island for logs and ropes. A story of a people who, blinded by ambition, destroyed their own environment and descended into starvation and war. It is said to be the ultimate parable of a paradise lost. But what if that story, while compelling, is largely incorrect? What if it's a simplistic narrative that obscures a far more complex and fascinating truth? A truth about brilliant, elegant engineering that walked the statues from the quarry, the truth about ingenious farmers who adapted to a changing environment, and about a resilient culture whose most devastating collapse came not from within, but from the catastrophic arrival of the outside world. To help us deconstruct these powerful myths and understand the nuanced realities of Rapa Nui, we have a perfect guide today. James Grant Peterkin is a cultural historian and the author of A Companion to Easter Island. But he is not just an academic observing from afar. He arrived on Rapa Nui in 1996, a linguistic student from Cambridge, and what was meant to be a short stay turned into 2 decades of his life. He has served as a British Honorary Consul on the island and has dedicated his life to understanding and communicating the deep past and the living present day culture of the Rapa Nui people. So let's jump right into that discussion. James, thanks for joining today. I mean, it's wonderful to have you join Roots and Realities. So very happy to have you here with us today, and I'm looking forward to the next half an hour or 1 hour, however long it takes, because it's wonderful to have you here with us. So let me straight away jump into the one of my first questions here, James. Is your journey to Easter Island, or as we call Rapa Nui, is definitely fascinating. I read about you that you arrived in 1996 as a young linguistics student from Cambridge. And what was meant to be a very short stay turned into over 2 decades of your life in Rapa Nui. Can you take us back to that initial encounter? Like, what was it about that island, its people, and its culture that so profoundly captured you and you refused to let it go?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Manu, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, it was a completely unexpected, dramatic turn in my life because I went there, as you said, to study linguistics. I went to learn the indigenous language that they speak on Easter Island, which is called Rapa Nui, the language as well. And it just happened that as I spent more time there, it was quite a culture shock, of course, at the beginning. It was very different to my upbringing, and I'd been at boarding school in England for most of my education. And so I suddenly came across this completely different reality. It was a fascinating society, remote island. There wasn't much tourism at that stage. And for some reason, it just ticked lots of boxes that I didn't really know I was particularly curious about. I was fascinated by the history of the island, the mystery of Easter Island that has always been so well known. But also, it was just the population that were living there, this very small, isolated community. And I found them incredibly friendly, incredibly open to an outsider who was trying to learn their language and making a lot of mistakes with their language, of course. And it just sort of gathered pace from there. And of course, I went back, I completed my studies, but it was just at the end of university, I decided that I thought I would go for one more year to Rapa Nui to kind of scratch that itch. And that's what ultimately turned into 19 more years of my life after that.
It's wonderful. I like the point where you mentioned you were intrigued by its history and the mystery. I like that part, like because that's what Roots and Realities is all about: is understanding the history and deciphering the mystery behind it, while understanding the culture and the history and the society. So, very interesting story there that you were there, and you talked about Rapa Nui, and you said that the language is also called Rapa Nui. So I have a question around that because I heard it as what is it called? Rongo script. So I have a question around that. Probably the language is called Rapa Nui, the script is called Rongo. I'll hear more about that from you. But based on your academic background, which of course you are interested in learning how cultures communicate and the meaning of of those communication, etc. I have read that Rapa Nui is a place, defined by profound communicative challenges, like a largely broken oral tradition, because it's been a history of oral tradition most of the time. And then there is the
Hmm.
Rongo script, which I still think it's undeciphered, and of course the Moai. That's how it's
Yes,
pronounced. I would assume Moai.
Moai.
So how Moai, perfect. So how has your training as a linguist shaped the way you interpreted the island's history? Because you said that you were intrigued by their history and the mystery. So how was your journey as a linguist shaped the way you interpret the island's history? And does it give you a different lens through which to view these interesting moais, or what we call the great silent statues, right? So just if you can go through that interesting story of that, about a bit of that language and the script and etc., that would be wonderful.
Of course. So, I mean, the first important point to make is that the island was never, it was never completely abandoned by humans, so that the human population got very small at one time, possibly at one time just over 100 people living on Easter Island. And so that's why, as you say, you have this very fractured, disjointed oral history, but that's all we've really got. And particularly until anybody deciphers the Rongo Rongo script, which appears to be the only written language found anywhere in Polynesia, anywhere in the Pacific. So it's of particular interest to linguists, and some linguists have spent their entire academic careers trying to decipher the Rongo Rongo script, this mysterious written language that seems to be the language of perhaps the aristocracy, perhaps the most learned people on Easter Island, created these schools where they taught it. And so it did become a form of communication. But I don't think it was widely used. And therefore, what you generally have is an oral history passed down. You see the influence of Christianity in it. So it's a very difficult oral history to interpret. But that fundamentally is all we really have before the Europeans arrive for trying to understand what was taking place on Easter Island before the arrival of outsiders. And the island is really it's a study of isolation, and that's what makes it so interesting, because you don't get these influences from outside, you don't get influences from other people arriving to the island. You have this one tiny community, a small society that lives by itself, completely remote from the rest of the world for seemingly up to 700 years, until the Europeans chance on Easter Island and, if you like, they open it up to the rest of the world. But for that reason, the oral history has an enormous importance today. The problem is that, of course, when you've had a decimation of the population, when you've had influences from Christianity and other like such things, then of course it gets affected negatively. And so that's why, from a linguistic point of view, it's this fascinating balance between trying to understand some of the oral history, which you need to speak and understand the local language in order to do so, adding in the what academics are trying to decipher with Rongo Rongo, speaking to islanders even today who have a clear idea about what the statues mean, what their ancestors were doing when they carved them. And you put this all together and hopefully come up with something that is coherent and makes some kind of sense.
No, very interesting because as you mentioned, like there was so many influences over time with European contacts, and of course later on with the Chilean contact, etc. Right? Like so, it affects a lot. I mean, I come from India as a cultural background, and as you must have known the history that how it has influenced over time with various cultures being intermingled with Indian earlier
Of course.
civilizations and the
Yeah.
culture and how it has evolved. So I can totally understand which perspective you're coming from too, from about that. Especially like some of the traditions in India had been passed on orally, and most of them were written later on, like the great epics like Mahabharata or Ramayana, etc., were written later on. So
Right.
we don't know how much have been lost in the translation and in the transition. So totally understand how much of history or the actual information would have been lost, and everything is based on interpretation from the current researchers, right? That's an interesting point.
Yes, and very much also the person who is speaking with the islanders and recording it for the first time. Of course, it comes through that person's cultural lens as well, you know, and so that's open to distortion as well. How they understood it, whether they imposed their own European or Christian viewpoint on it, and so, I mean, it becomes very complicated, but fascinating, as you say, because it's part of the history.
So that brings me a very nice segue to my next question actually, because in your you wrote a guidebook for my audiences. Please do check out if you're visiting Easter Island or if you're planning to visit Rapa Nui, as we call it. It's called A Companion to Easter Island. It's a guidebook, and you in that book you state that it was written to bridge the gap between all the scientific research publications and very generic travel guides. So I'm curious to know, that means that you identified uh, how the story of the island, the history of the island was being told. So from your perspective on the ground, what is the single most persistent myth or misunderstanding about the island that you find yourself having to correct time and time again that you wanted to explain in your guidebook? What is that myth or very interesting fact?
Well, I think, I mean, the island has benefited enormously from this idea of it being mysterious and a great enigma, and therefore, certainly when I was living there, most people would say to me, you know, well, that's the island with those enormous great stone statues that no one knows why on earth they're there. And in fact, when you visit the island, it becomes very obvious why the statues were carved, what they represented, or who they represented, why they were transported to certain parts of the island. And so the point is that Easter Island is in fact by far the most studied island anywhere in the Pacific, for perhaps for obvious reasons. And that means that the scientific community has spent the last 100 years examining the island. And so actually we've been blessed with an enormous amount of study on the history of Easter Island, on the anthropology, the archaeology. And so that's why many of the mysteries that exist today have in fact been solved decades ago, but the island, of course, benefits from the fact that people want to see these places where there is a sense of mystery. And so I suppose in answer to that, yes, I mean, the problem is that most visitors to the island aren't going to read a scientific paper on one tiny, minuscule, very academic point about Easter Island, about sort of, you know, soil pH and things like that. But what always slightly broke my heart was the fact that Easter Island would be a tiny chapter at the end of a guidebook to Chile, for example. And living there for so long, I felt that for the visitor that came, to have 5 or 6 pages covering the whole of Easter Island was slightly shortchanging them as well. And so that's why I felt it was important, perhaps, to offer something that was slightly more, a slightly more robust account of what they would see. But yes, I think it's probably the mystery behind the statues, which in fact there isn't now today a great deal mystery at all, because scientists have done so much study there.
That's an interesting point because you said so. I mean, I was curious to hear that Easter Island is one of the islands which is most researched, at least in the Pacific Ocean, right? So, very interesting point there. But still, like even if I do my research, or hopefully my audiences, when they read about Easter Island or Rapa Nui, they must have heard about these same narratives of the mythical, the intriguing fact of like Moais and etc. Right? So, what do you
Mm-hmm.
think? Why do you think, or especially like, why do you think this particular narrative has been so powerful and difficult to dislodge from the global imagination? Like we always think Easter Island as this mystic place or land. Why do you think, even after so much research, this narrative is so powerful that we think Easter Island as this kind of a unique spot I mean, it is a unique spot, but with some mythical, interesting things. Why do you think that narrative is not changing then?
I mean, I think it's partly because mystery sells, and so that's why magazines love to do reports, endless videos on Easter Island and documentaries. But it's really because when the first Europeans arrived, which was, Easter Sunday, 1722, which is where the name for the island first came from, then they, of course, I mean, they couldn't understand what they were seeing. They'd never seen anywhere like it. There's nowhere else in the Pacific or in the world with these statues. And so if you put yourself in the shoes of a Dutch sailor who happened to be on board one of those ships in 1722, then of course this would have been an absolutely life altering experience to come across a culture as unusual as this one. And so you can see why when word got back to Europe of this and then the rest of the world, they of course were fascinated by these colossal statues, and no one knew how they'd managed to move them. There was a small population on the island which didn't of course represent what there had been at one time, but they didn't see any elephants, they didn't see any horses, they didn't see anything that they thought would mean this population was capable of moving, statues that weigh up to 100 tons. And so you can see why the world was so curious by the case of Easter Island. But it's just that fundamentally, most people don't read scientific papers. And so there's not a huge interest in actually correcting the narrative, I would say.
Mhm.
And, I mean, mystery intrigues people. And so if someone said, I mean, not that Easter Island has been solved by any stretch of the imagination, but the point is that I think in a way it's much more exciting for a documentary to offer this sort of a narrative of mysterious, enigmatic Easter Island, blind statues that won't reveal their secrets and all that sort of thing, which to some degree is true because there are enormous amounts of details we still don't understand. But I would say much more is, of course, known thanks to the hard work of scientists over the last century.
Yeah, and thanks to people like you who have written actual guidebooks to help us understand the culture and what to actually look for and what it is made up of, right? So thanks to you too. So
Well, that's kind.
continuing
I
on,
wanted
yeah.
to distill it. That was the point. I wanted to distill lots of this quite scientific, dense, quite heavy information, and hopefully make it slightly more readable.
Absolutely. So that brings me to the next question because when I read about Easter Island, or even now, if I go to Google or searching anything around Easter Island or Rapa Nui, I think I should prefer calling it Rapa Nui. It gives that nice
I
essence
think you can use
in a way.
both because in the West we're so much more comfortable referring to it as Easter Island. But of course, locally there is a movement to use its Polynesian name. So I think your listeners hopefully will understand that it's the same island and that in a way you have to know both names.
Perfect. That's good to know. So what I have read about Rapa Nui has always been, especially about the statues, is how huge they are. Like they're very heavy, and they were and it always intrigues you. Okay, if they're heavy, wow, how they were created or made, and how they were moved from one place to other because it is wherever I read it, it's written that it's quarried from volcanic rock and it was moved and placed on a platform called Ahi or Ahu, and
Ahu,
then
yes, very good.
Ahu, and then that's where the Moai were kept. On top of that, it's a huge undertaking, right? So I have read that theories where they are talked about that they were moved on logs, like logs moving as wheels across from the volcanic rock up to here. The other thing that the recent studies is called the walking theory. That's what
Hmm.
intrigued me to connect with you too when I was reading about all those things, about to understand what is the right thing or the correct thing. Is it talks about like they were moving with angled bases, with specific center of gravity, etc. That's how the statues walked. So that's very interesting because there is this brute force that is required here with logs and etc. to pull. And there is this understanding of engineering and technique to actually move them. That's a huge two different theories out there. What do you think that this change in theory or this thinking also applies how we look at Rapa Nui's culture as they developed over time? How do you see that differences in that? And which one do you think actually happened from your perspective?
Well, I think it's a good reminder that there are still an enormous amount of facets to the Rapa Nui culture. that we don't know and probably will never know. And that's the beauty of it. I mean, that's the fact that scientists will continue to go there, as long as academia is interested on Easter Island, because it's incredibly difficult to find the answers. But of course, everyone wants to discover what did happen. Um, I mean, transportation's a good example where you have one school of thought that they were put on these enormous statues that I said weighed up to 100 tons, were placed on a sled of some kind and then dragged over rollers. And this was used as a mechanism for them to be transported sometimes up to 20 miles across the island. And then more recently, particularly in a study that came from the University of Hawaii, they came up with this idea of the rocking idea, that you would move it a bit like a refrigerator and kind of get it onto its corners and then waddle it forward. And I think the beauty is we'll probably never know. In reality, if you know that you're moving something heavy in your home or wherever, you will know that you sometimes use different techniques depending on the terrain. So it's not just that it's either one or the other. It's probably one for a period of time, another later on, or once you get near to the final platform that you want to place the statue on. But I must just add that the wonderful thing about Easter Island, and this is very unusual, is that you can see the entire process from start to finish. So it's not like going to the pyramids or the Taj Mahal and, for example, admiring this incredible creation. You can actually see the end products, the statues standing on their platforms, but you can also go all the way back to the quarry. You can see them carved in the stone. You can walk down the roads that they would have been transported down, and there are some lying broken along the roads. And so this is why you can see the whole process from start to finish. And that's why anyone who's curious and anyone has a sort of amateur archaeologist, it means that you can go to Easter Island and really look at it in completely. And that's why it's such a privilege to study anything related to Easter Island.
Wow, I'm curious. Like if there are few places, like I visited the pyramids, I visited Chichen Itza, at least so far, of the places that I would like to visit. Easter
Okay.
Island is definitely one of my bucket lists, so hopefully I can visit sometime in the future
Yeah,
and
please
look
do.
with my own eyes of how this
Yes.
must have done, because it's always intriguing. And that's the sad part of this story, is that all these cultures, etc. Like when I went to visit the pyramids of Giza, I mean, or if I went to Chichen Itza, there is so much story in that, right? And so much history has gone through, and we don't know how they built them, and because of the loss of the culture and loss of those the earlier civilizations or the populations, as we call it, right? And the same thing brings me back to Rapa Nui too, because when I read about Rapa Nui, I read about this tale of ecocide, where a society destroyed itself through with this obsession of statue building. Let's cut all the logs, palm trees. Let's make the sleds, and that led to starvation, war between themselves. On the other side, there is another story about a Polynesian rat that they brought to the island, and that started eating all the seeds. So there was deforestation, and there was no regeneration. So it's intriguing, all these stories, and everything happened that they were killing each other. They died before the pre-contact. When I say pre-contact, before the European contact, right? So why do we outside of Rapa Nui we see these kind of stories? Is it true, or what must have happened? Is the rat story true, or what is it about that? Could you explain a bit on that?
Well, so again, it's a good example of what the first Europeans found when they first stumbled across the island. They weren't looking for an island. They didn't expect to find an island, and yet they came across this island with this sort of enormous culture present in front of them. Because you can't ignore, there are almost 1,000 statues on Easter Island. People often underestimate how extensive the carving culture was. And yet, at the same time, they came across a relatively impoverished community, and they simply couldn't align the two. They said, how could it possibly be that this impoverished people with a small population, um, you know, didn't look healthy? How could they have possibly created all of this? And so this is where UFO theories began. This is where the idea that Easter Island might be some part of Atlantis or something. So all of these crazy ideas came. Um, and so what that really meant was that again, there was this sort of confusion for hundreds of years about what had actually taken place on Easter Island. Now, what we do know is that Polynesians settled pretty much every single habitable island in the Pacific. And when they did so, they took and introduced Polynesian rats with them. And so what it means is that today, scientists are looking less at human bones and human DNA and actually looking at the bones of these Polynesian rats to actually put a time scale on this entire migration. And that's why they've more or less worked out the timings of when people arrived. Now, in the case of Easter Island, it does seem that the Polynesian rats that they introduced took a certain they took a liking to the seeds of the palm trees, and they therefore perhaps prevented these trees from regenerating naturally, from germinating. So that would have affected the ability of the forests to regenerate. But at the same time, there's always been this idea that therefore that Easter Island is this perfect example of human greed, of ecocide, as you say, this ecological suicide, where humans destroy the one habitat that they have. And this is why, of course, for many years, people used the example of Easter Island as a warning sign to humankind for what we might be doing on planet Earth. They said, look, we've got this one island, and one planet in our case. We've got nowhere to leave. We can't escape the island in the way that the islanders on Rapa Nui couldn't escape the island once they cut down most of the trees. And we've got nowhere nearby, which the Rapa Nui also didn't have, meaning that could it be that they actually, were so obsessed with this idea of larger and larger statues that they were blind to the fact that they were in fact destroying their environment at the same time.
Interesting, because the ecocide or the ecological suicide theory, like which talks about all this information and about deforestation, the Polynesian rat, etc. Somewhere I have read that this is something as a theory, so as to avoid or to take the narrative out of the colonial or the post contact effect on the islanders, because the other side of the theory is that, well, it was not the culture didn't destroy or got destroyed, or ended up because of all that ecocide theory, but because of post contact effect of diseases. And I think Peruvian people, slave raids happened in 1860s, where, as you mentioned in the
Mhm.
earlier, that the population was reduced to just a mere 100 people around. So the ecocide theory takes away the narrative from this post-contact effect, which could have actually resulted in the end of the culture, or destruction of the culture in that way, as we have seen in other Central American countries, etc. Too, right? As per the narrative. So, as someone who lived with, the modern Rapa Nui community, what is that impact of these two theories, and what do they feel? Which one is right? Which one is wrong? Or what do you think too? Like, how did this kind of narratives affect them too? Because they are the people who are living through that now and taking their culture forward. What is these kind of effects of both these theories on them?
So I think this idea of ecocide obviously didn't sit very well with the local community. I think no one likes to think of their ancestors making grave mistakes. And that's why it became quite easy for everyone to start blaming simply outsiders. That the Rapa Nui culture was perfect, that they were living this kind of, this idyllic utopian dream in the South Pacific. Suddenly a white man arrived and destroyed everything and spread diseases and destroyed the culture and pulled down the statues. And that's not in fact true. And any historian worth their salt knows the fact that in fact this collapse, as it's called, was already taking place internally. And it just so happened that the outsiders arrived and didn't really know what they were seeing, but they of course, in certain respects, witnessed it, and to some degree as well, were catalysts to it happening even faster. They would have introduced diseases naturally. They would have also perhaps changed the society when, for the first time in 700 years, the islanders saw people with different colored skin wearing clothes, sailing these tremendous sail ships. And so, of course, that's going to affect the local culture as well. The point was, the early Europeans, most of them only stayed for one or no more than a week, one day or up to a week. And so it's difficult to see how that stage they could have an enormous impact on really changing the course of the culture. Now, of course, later, about 100 years later, when the missionaries arrive, then that really is a seismic change because the missionaries stay on the island. They, of course, relatively successfully convert the islanders to Christianity. They change the belief system. They try and introduce a different language. And so missionaries, of course, today get something of a bad rap because um, they fundamentally did make some seismic changes. But I think for the early Europeans, then we can't extend it to them as well.
That's an interesting point because again, yeah, that I get it because one of the other things I have also read about the culture around that time when the contact was made is about this birdman cult. That there is a they started the culture was that you need to swim across the tide and go to a particular place, pick up a egg from bird's nest and bring it back, and that they will be chosen as a leader. I have read that this was during European contact and not prior to that. So it's all confusing of how the information has been relied and etc. But have you heard about this birdman culture and what how this impacted and was it really after the post European contact that it was a story or however that evolved? Like, can you shed some light on
Well,
that?
yeah, sure. I mean, it was actually taking place already when the first Europeans arrived. So again, it's not something the Europeans introduced or in any way made happen. Point to understand is that the Birdman competition is an enormous success story because
Mhm.
clearly the island hit the tipping point when it was obvious that the island was going on a bad path, and that if they carried on behaving as they were, carving enormous statues which require a great deal of resources, if they carried on doing all of this, then they were going to wipe themselves out and their island. And so what they did was they stopped doing that part of the culture. They stopped carving statues, and so instead of honoring ancestors, which is what the enormous statues represent, they decided on something that was far less, that used far fewer resources. What instead they came up with was an annual race where each tribe had the opportunity, and the race was to collect the first egg of a sooty tern. This is a type of bird that arrives on the island to lay its eggs and raise its chicks. And so the arrival of these birds from outside would have been a tremendous event every year anyway. What they decide to do is they abandon the quarry, they abandon where they're doing all of the carving, they stop transporting the statues, they stop erecting them on platforms, and instead they now focus on this competition, which just requires the collecting of one egg, in theory, for that then to decide very democratically who the leader of the island will be for the next 12 months until they come back and do it again. And so people often see it as this sort of bizarre ritual that came into being out of nowhere or perhaps introduced by Europeans, when in fact it was the solution the islanders themselves came up with long before any outsider had told them what to do or suggested that they might want to change their cultural practices. And yet, by themselves, they've realized that we've got to change our behavior, change our culture, really, if we're going to survive. And that's why the Birdman competition. I mean, it's fascinating to see all of the detail, and we don't know all of the detail either about it, but we know more than about the statues. But at the same time, it's a wonderful example of a culture adapting to its circumstances and its condition.
Yeah, that's very interesting because when I read about that, it was very interesting to see how they have evolved that. And thanks for shedding light on that because it also tells how they have identified their problems or and came up with some different solutions to move away from the Moai constructions, etc., and moved away. So that's very interesting. So that also brings me to another question that I wanted to ask you, because for a culture to evolve is one thing from a traditional point of view, from the rituals, from the activities that they do, etc. But it's very intriguing to also not only develop a language like Rapa Nui language, but also to actually have a script because like there are very few writing systems in human history to be invented in complete isolation, and at that time, and being on an island and not only just creating a language, but actually creating a script. So I'm just curious to know what level of intellectual or cultural sophistication does it imply for a society to invent writing from scratch without outside influence? Like, and can you explain a bit about that script, Rango script, and how, as a linguist, that intrigue you, and what do you see as a linguist, how it developed, and as an isolated culture, how they would have done that?
So it really began when the missionaries arrived on Easter Island during the 19th century. They noticed that the islanders had these wooden boards decorated with this beautiful hieroglyphic form of writing. And they noticed that not only could they read them, but when they read them, they turned them. As they were reading them, they were turning them at sort of 180 degrees every line. But also they noticed that the two people read the same board differently because, of course, they saw these boards. They asked islanders to read them. And so the missionaries assumed that they were making up what they were saying. They thought they were trying to impress the outsiders. But it wasn't that at all. And the belief is that this very intricate form of writing, it's not a phonetic language. It's not that each symbol represents a sound, but actually that they serve as almost memory joggers, markers to tell them as they're telling a long story, or perhaps going through a genealogy of who is, son of who, daughter of who, son of who, that these act as reminders as they tell it. And that's why each one sounded differently. So there's always been this fascination with this Rongo Rongo script. It's the only writing of its kind. The fact there is no Rosetta Stone in existence means that we'll probably never know what, in fact, those tablets mean. There are only 26 tablets left in existence. So again, there's an enormously small amount of data for scientists and linguists in particular to work with. Perhaps AI might make some interesting breakthroughs a bit strong, but it might be interesting to see when AI is used on Rongo Rongo, whether that might serve to discover something that humans haven't been able to up until now. But I think this is the point. For a society to develop its own written language by itself, so prior to European contact, which is what we believe Rongo Rongo script is, then that clearly shows a level of sophistication, a level of intellect and development that is not of a society that's sort of short-sighted and simply sort of surviving from day to day. And so that's why, again, it throws open this question even more, makes it so much more interesting, because every time that you're trying to, you assume that the Rapa Nui made lots of mistakes as they went along, but of course, at the same time, they were developing this unique form of written language about which, their ancestors have never had any experience elsewhere in the Pacific, as far as we know. And so it does show, again, the results of isolation. And I come back to this as I started, saying that if you study Easter Island and Rapa Nui, it really becomes a study of humans in isolation. And that's what makes it so interesting. And that's why, when I said it was the most studied island, it's because so many different facets of science are interested in Easter Island. It's not just archaeologists, it's not just anthropologists, but botanists. I mean, anyone that wants to look at almost a virgin human society, and take Easter Island as a wonderful example, because you've got one group that arrived on the island, possibly stayed there for 700 years with no further contact from either Polynesia or elsewhere in the world, until suddenly on Easter Sunday, 1722, 3 European ships turn up. So it's an incredible story just in itself, even if there wasn't the culture behind it.
Now, very fascinating. Like if you look at across the globe, the ancient languages, most of them are hieroglyphic, right? So I'm always curious to see how did they develop these kind of things, and developing it in isolation. Oh, I mean, that's something very interesting. And that's what I'm also curious to know, because the knowledge of how to read that script wouldn't have been lost to time, right? Because it could have what I read is that it would have been due to the Peruvian slave raiders that abducted the island's people, so it must have lost after that, because there were very few people who would be able to read or write, etc. So as a linguist, for example, who understands how languages are very important in communicating and etc., when you look at these hieroglyphs which are unreadable right now, how do you feel? Like, is it the intellectual frustration of an unsolved puzzle that is still out there to be resolved, or do you see the human tragedy of a silenced voice because it was actually taken away from the island, the ability to read that script and write, right? So how do you see that as a linguistic person?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's it's an interesting mix because, of course, on one level, it's an enormous admiration for what they achieved, and of course, an enormous respect for their ability to come up with this language. But it's interesting because you look at those boards, and many of the symbols are symbols from day-to-day life on the island. I mean, they're symbols of birds and trees and fish, men, women, I mean, humans. And so you can see it's very real language. And so in a way, it is this window into the past. And so, of course, you then, that's coupled with frustration with the fact that you can't understand them because, of course, we're all curious. We all want to know as much as we possibly can. We don't like things that we don't understand. And so I think many people in the academic community would love to get some kind of breakthrough. But I think it's also lovely that the island guards its secrets and the fact that that you can't just Google a translation of Rongo Rongo and you get the answer. And it means that you and I and anyone can come along. You can look at there are images of the 26 boards that are in existence online. You can take a look for yourself and see what it means to you. And that's why, I mean, there's an Easter Island conference that takes place once every 4 years. And there's almost an entire day dedicated to what people have learned or what they've studied regarding Rongo Rongo during the 4 year period since we've last all got together. And so it's lovely to see that this is still, it's still so fascinating to so many people. And so I think there's a real, I mean, it would be lovely to know what the script meant, but at the same time, isn't it wonderful to have things that we really don't understand and probably never will?
That's interesting. I just want to know when is the next conference, just so that we can maybe keep an eye on that. Do you have any idea?
I think it's meant to be every 4 years, and so in theory there should be one next year because the last one was in 2022. So
Perfect.
I haven't heard yet where it's going to be. I think possibly Chicago, I heard, but I haven't heard. So it's fun because once every 4 years, all of the sort of Easter Island geeks, we all get together. And I learn an enormous amount because you find out what people from all over the world have been studying related to Easter Island, and it's an enormously wide breadth of study.
One thing you mentioned as you were explaining about the script and etc. is that it's the intrigueness or the mystery of the script helps you to keep going back to Easter Island or invites others like me who are interested to know more about the island, etc., to go to the island and visit and understand more about the culture and understanding the community, etc. Right? So I want to also ask you, how does the Rapa Nui community navigate this dilemma of balancing the sacred duty of preserving their cultural, environmental treasures like the Moai statues, etc. Whereas they also would like to have the necessity of the tourism, like people like me coming to the island. How do you think they balance that? Because they need to continue with the cultural thing, protect it, extend it as long as possible, but the economic necessity of the tourism is also as important as that, right? So how do you see that? Like, how are they moving ahead with this challenge?
Well, yeah, so it's not an easy one, and it's not just Easter Island that is having to deal with this, of course. In the case of the island, it's unusual because tourism is relatively recent. People are often surprised to know that when I first went there in 1996, there really wasn't much tourism. There were only 2 flights a week. It was incredibly expensive to get there, difficult, and so all of these things meant that there really wasn't much tourism until the start, perhaps of from the 2000s onwards. So the island's come to this quite new. The island, understandably, is enjoying the economic benefits now of a sort of rampant tourism industry. But people are also very aware that one island, it's very much their home, and they don't want to ruin it by sort of selling out to tourism and having too much tourism. So I think what they're doing, quite rightly, is trying to learn lessons from other, particularly island cultures and communities. I know when I was last there was a trip to the Galapagos Islands that some of the island leaders went on to try and learn the lessons that perhaps the Galapagos could teach them. I think people noted with interest when, for example, Machu Picchu began limiting the number of people to their sites. I think it was 6,000 people per day. Easter Island's nowhere near those numbers, but people are aware that every year we've gone up by 10, 20,000 visitors. The interest is out there. Images of Easter Island are incredibly popular on social media. And so it's not difficult. Many people, and you're a good example, of course, know about Easter Island. They think I would like to see that during my lifetime. I'd like to see it with my own eyes. And hopefully people do. I just think what's going to happen is that the island will get better at developing a sustainable tourism model. And that's very much what the island's in the middle of at the moment, of that development. It's not perfect by any means. There are times I think when they feel it's slightly overrun. But I would say that one of the lovely things about the island to this day is that it absorbs people very well, and you can go there and you can still actually almost feel that there's barely anyone else on the island with you. And so it's a wonderful, if you can just avoid some of the main sites at the main times, it's amazing how quiet you can get some of the sites as well. And so that's why I don't think the island has lost in any way any of its allure. I just think that they're well aware that they have to be very careful about managing tourism in such a way. But I think there are plenty of examples, and if they're willing to pay attention to some of those examples, the good ones and the not so good ones, then there's no reason why Easter Island won't continue to be an excellent tourism destination for hopefully generations to come.
And definitely we would love to, whoever should visit or is planning to visit Easter Island should read your guidebook too, I would assume, to give that
Oh,
perspective,
thank you.
gain that perspective too, right? So I want to ask you another question around that, because you lived there not just as a part of the community, etc., but you also had a very interesting role for almost 14 years. You served as the British Honorary Consul on the island. That's a unique role to play. I mean, but that diplomatic role must have also given you a vantage point on this complex relationship between the Rapa Nui community and the Chilean state right now, right? Because I've heard of the ongoing struggle about to reclaim the heritage of Rapa Nui, to have a greater say in the stewardship of their ancestral home, etc. For the Rapa Nui community. So, but again, without betraying any confidences or confidential information, what can you tell us about what is the modern struggle for cultural and political autonomy on Rapa Nui today? Again, this is roots and realities. We need to understand the society. So, hence the question.
I mean, yes, it's very complex, of course, because the island belongs to Chile. I mean, it's part of Chile since 1888. The official language on the island is Spanish, although most of the Rapa Nui speak the indigenous language, Rapa Nui, as well. Half of the population today comes from Chile. And so you've got these two cultures living side by side, don't necessarily see the world in the same way. They don't necessarily see the island in the same way. So yes, it's not an easy relationship. If you've been to any island or place where you have two cultures living alongside each other, you'll know that it's not. These things are never straightforward. Um, I have to say, I was fortunate, I think, and I would admit this, that it was easier to be a foreigner on Easter Island living there than perhaps it would have been if I'd been Chilean. Now, I mean, there are plenty of wonderful Chilean people living on the island to this day who are very much part of the community. They've married people. There's lots of intermarriage between Rapa Nui and Chilean, lots of intermarriage as well between Rapa Nui and foreigners. But it was always easier, in my sense, to be a complete outsider. And now you mentioned about my role as the honorary British consul. I was actually the only Brit living on Easter Island, and so it wasn't a particularly difficult role, perhaps, to get, because when I was aware that there were honorary consuls in other parts of the world representing their own government, I went to the British government and said, look, I'm living on this island. Would you like someone? I didn't really know what the job entailed, but I thought, would you like someone, to do this role? And I think they were quite pleased to have, the first honorary consul on Easter Island. And it was a really interesting role, actually, because yes, you would receive, important visitors when they came to the island. You tended to show them around, or at least have meetings with them. But also you tended to help people when they were in their absolute most sort of desperate need, because something had gone terribly wrong while they were on Easter Island. And I mean, no one wants to have bad things happen when you travel anyway. But least of all, you want them to happen when you're on one of the world's most isolated inhabited islands. And so often, people would get sick or have accidents or things would happen. And so for 24 or 48 hours, you would become their sort of, I suppose, their refuge in a way, because you were someone that spoke their language, understood their culture as a foreigner. So it was fascinating. I met an enormous variety of people through it. Was able, hopefully, to help some people along the way. But it was just, I suppose it gave me then also an unusual insight into the community as well, because I also knew much more about what was taking place in Chile and Santiago in relationship with the island, what was happening at government level, and you could see how this affected then life on the island as well. And so no, I was very fortunate to do it.
So that's very interesting story about your role in the diplomatic role. So thanks for sharing that. At the
Very
same
well.
time, I have actually watched your TEDx talk, and of course that finally puts your perspective on what 20 years living on Easter Island has taught me. That was the topic. That's the title. So let me ask you a question because I want to understand from those 20 years of you living there. We hear the story of Rapa Nui as a cautionary tale of complex, a story of brilliant engineering with building those statues, profound adaptation after post-contact, as the culture was dwindling down, and of course of incredible resilience and survival against forces far beyond their control. So that's the story we hear. So after living for almost 2 decades with this complicated story, what do you believe is the most important lesson Rapa Nui has to offer the world today?
So I think contrary to rather than using Rapa Nui always as this example of human mistakes and greed and mismanagement of resources, I think what I would urge people to do, hopefully, is to study the history a bit more, to hopefully visit in person as well, and to realize, in fact, that this was a much more complex case than simply a group of human beings trying to outdo each other with carving larger and larger statues. And that, in fact, what we see is an isolated community dealing with incredibly difficult problems that they were being presented with no preparation for it, really. I mean, they had no model on which to base themselves by the time that these things were beginning to go wrong. And yet they overcame. So this is a wonderful story of resilience. It's a wonderful story of adaptation. And so therefore, if we're going to use the Easter Island story as a microcosm of planet Earth, if it's going to be a metaphor for what humankind is doing to the planet today, then hopefully people will see that actually there should be a degree of optimism taught to us by the history of Easter Island because they clearly adapted. They survived. Yes, they got to very small numbers. Things got fairly precarious at one point or over an extended period of time, but they came through. And the fact that you visit the island today, there's a robust Rapa Nui population. You can hear the Rapa Nui language still spoken. There's an enormous pride in what their ancestors achieved. That has only happened because the population never disappeared. They never abandoned the island, and so I think that's why hopefully we can use the island's story. Yes, a very cautionary tale, but at the same time, hopefully with something of a kind of a degree of optimism at the end of it, and that's certainly what I left the island after 20 years. I certainly left feeling that it was an island that was in a great place, that it was going places, that it was dealing with the current challenges of tourism and uh, climate change and extreme weather and all the things that affect the rest of the world as well. But that they were in, well prepared and in good hands for what future held.
Wonderful. I mean, I appreciate you mentioning about being resilient and optimism. The optimism you showed from the to learn from the island, right? Because that's what we all would love to do. That as someone like myself who have lived in 3 continents and actually lived and worked in 4 different countries, I started appreciating the local cultures and the communities and the histories and the optimism that they show on how to continue their culture. So I really appreciated chatting with you today, and thanks for taking us through the overall history, the mystery, and the current state, and actually going through the core of roots and realities with us today of Rapa Nui. So James, thank you very much, and I would wish you all the very best. And I wish that someday I would visit Easter Island. I'll read your guidebook and actually visit the Easter Island, and hopefully we can meet someday. And at the same time, I would ask all my audiences to definitely watch your TEDx talk and go through your articles. Wonderful, some of them that I have read, and get a different perspective of. You're a part of the community without being a part of the community, right? So it's a nice perspective to look at that. So I would appreciate everybody if they can go through watch your TEDx talk and etc. And thank you very much for being on Roots and Realities. And I really appreciate you taking time, the passion you have for Rapa Nui and the information you have. And I hope someday you are able to read the scripts and enjoy and actually get more information, because that's the passion that led you there in the first time.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Manu. And it's a pleasure always to talk to about Easter Island to anyone that of course is interested. I hope that you do visit for yourself. I mean, it's also a beautiful island. I think it's worth mentioning that it is a stunning island in itself. It's a curious place to visit. It's an unusual place to visit, and I hope that you and any of your listeners that are interested will find the time to make it there and see it. Because to be honest, to stand face to face with these statues is an experience like none other, and so I would highly recommend it to anyone that has that curiosity about history and particularly to the lost cultures, but certainly old cultures that perhaps have changed considerably today. So thank you very much as well, Manu, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.